Chapter 9. I sat in my dark hut and felt both angry and sad. One half of me wanted to hurt the people who had hurt me. The other half of me still loved them. In the end, I decided to try and speak to the old man again. I fell into an unhappy sleep. But when I woke in the morning, the family had gone. They had left the house during the night. I knew the name of only one other person. Although I had seen you, Frankestein, for only a few moments, I knew that I belonged to you. When I had left your house, I had picked up a small bag. There was a book in the bag, and I could now read it. From it, I learnt my Creator's name and address. You had made me, but why had you not looked after me and saved me from this pain and unhappiness? I decided to go to Geneva to find you. One day, as I was traveling, I saw a young girl running along the side of a river. Suddenly, she fell into the water. I jumped into the river, fought against the fast-moving water, and brought her back to land. While I was doing this, the girl's father, who was looking for her, reached us. He was carrying a gun, and when he saw me, he fired. The bullet hit my arm and broke it. I fell to the ground in great pain, and the man and the girl ran into the woods as fast as they could, and left me. The bullet was deep in my arm, and I lost a lot of blood. After some days, my arm began to get better, but I became sadder and angrier than before. I had saved the girl's life, and how did they thank me? With a bullet in the arm. I began to realize that there was no happiness for me in life. Hate grew stronger in me every day. Hate for you, my Creator, who had made me. 2 months later, I reached Geneva. That evening, I hid among some trees outside the town and went to sleep. But I woke when a little boy ran into my hiding place. I thought I would catch the child and make him my friend before he was old enough to be frightened of my terrible face. I caught the little boy. But when the child saw me, he covered his eyes with his hands and screamed loudly.
"Let me go, you monster!"
the child shouted.
"Let me go, or I will tell my father, Mr. Frankestein. He will call the police, and they'll punish you."
"Frankestein," I shouted, "you belong to my enemy, the man that I want to hurt." The child fought and screamed, and I put my hand round his neck to stop him shouting. In a moment, the child lay dead at my feet. I looked down at his body and was pleased with what I had done. I knew that the death of this child would hurt you, Victor Frankestein, my Creator. Then I saw something bright round the child's neck. It was a gold chain, and on the end of it was a picture of a very beautiful woman. I knew that a beautiful woman would never smile at me, and I wanted to run into Geneva and kill as many people as I could. But I stopped myself and went to look for another hiding place. Soon I found a hut, which seemed to be empty. But when I entered, I saw a pretty young woman asleep on the floor. I hated her because she was pretty. So I put the gold chain into one of her pockets, and then, before she could wake up, I ran away. I knew the police would think that she had killed the little boy. Chapter 10. Victor Frankenstein continues his story. The monster finished telling me his story, and then he said, "I am alone and miserable. Only someone as ugly as I am could love me. You must make another creature like me, a woman monster, to be my wife." "I shall never make another creature like you," I shouted. "You have done enough evil on your own." "If you don't help me, I shall make you more miserable than you have ever been in your life. You will wish you were dead," the monster said. "But if you make another monster to be my friend, we won't hurt anyone. Be kind to me now, and I will learn to love and be kind." I thought long and hard about the monster's words. I felt sorry for him. He was so miserable. Perhaps I should help him. "I shall do what you ask," I told him. "But you must promise to live somewhere in the world where nobody lives. You must promise to stay away from other people." "I promise, I promise," he cried. "Please start your work. I shall watch you, and when you are ready, you can be sure I will come back." He turned and left me, and ran down the mountain. I went back to Geneva immediately. My family were very worried when they saw me. I was pale, and my eyes were wild. I could not forget my promise to the monster, and the awful work that waited for me. But I had to do it. It was the only way to keep my family safe. Safe from his murdering hands around their necks. I needed to study for several months to make a woman monster successfully. I heard that an English scientist had done some useful work, so I decided to go to England. Before I went, my father asked me, "Are you going to marry Elizabeth, or do you love another woman? Is this why you are so unhappy?" "No, father," I replied. "I have always loved Elizabeth, and I want to marry her. But I must do one more piece of scientific work before we can marry. I must go to England to do the work, and I want to marry Elizabeth when I return." My father and Elizabeth did not want me to go to England alone, because I had been so ill. They spoke to my old friend Henry Clerval, and he was very happy to travel with me. I was pleased that he could come, although I did not want him to discover anything about my horrible work. Henry and I reached London in early October and stayed there for a few months. I met and talked with English scientists and learnt many useful things from them. Then Henry was invited to visit some friends in Scotland. I planned to travel with him, but I told him that I wanted to go walking in the mountains alone. Henry was not happy with my plan, but in the end he agreed. I bought all that I needed for a laboratory and sent everything to Scotland. Henry and I travelled to Edinburgh together, and then I went further north to find a good place for my laboratory. At last, I found the right place on an island off the north coast. It was a wild and lonely place. Only 5 people lived on the island, so I could work alone, and nobody would discover my awful secret. There was a large, empty hut on the island, and I brought builders from Scotland to make the hut into a laboratory for me. I showed them how to build my mast, and soon everything was ready for me to start work on the woman monster. Chapter 11. One evening, 2 months later, I was sitting in my laboratory. Most of my work was done, and I could finish the woman monster that night. But I wondered if I should finish the work. Was I making a monster more evil than the first creature? Perhaps 1,000 times more evil. How could I know? Perhaps the woman monster would be another murderer. She had not promised to stay away from other people. Perhaps the 2 monsters would hate each other, and would kill and murder and destroy without end. As I thought these things, I looked up at the window. Suddenly, in the moonlight, I saw the monster's awful face looking at me, and in his yellow eyes I could see only hate and evil. I knew he would not keep his promise. I went over to the laboratory table where the new creature was lying. I pulled off the wires that joined her to my machine. I took a sharp knife and cut through the body that I had joined together so carefully. Through the window, the monster saw me destroy his woman. With a loud and miserable scream of sadness and lost hope, he ran into the laboratory. "You have destroyed all my hopes of happiness," he cried. "You have left me with one feeling, hate, and with one wish, to destroy your happiness. You will be sorry that you were ever born. Remember this, I shall be with you on your wedding night." He ran quickly out of the laboratory, and I watched him as he left the island in his boat and sailed away across the sea. I sat and cried as I thought of the danger to Elizabeth. But I knew that the monster would not visit us until our wedding night. I would not die easily, and I would try to kill him before he could kill me. The next morning, I received a letter from Henry. He told me that he was waiting for me to return. I decided to clear the laboratory and to leave the island on the following day. So I returned to the laboratory, where the pieces of the woman monster's body still lay on the floor. I put them all in a large bag with some heavy stones. Then I took the bag to my boat and sailed out to sea. I threw the bag into deep water and watched it disappear. I was happier than I had felt for months. I knew I had done the right thing, and now there would be no second monster to follow the first. I was very tired, and I went to sleep in the boat. I do not know how long I slept, but when I woke up, I was in the middle of a storm. The wind was driving me further out to sea, and my boat began to fill with water. I knew I was in great danger. After some hours, the storm passed, and I saw land to the south. Soon I could see the beach, and a crowd of people standing and watching me. Their faces were cold and unfriendly. As I landed, 4 of the men came towards me and took me by the arms. "We are taking you to Mr. Cohen, the judge. He wants to ask you some questions about the murder of a man here last night," one of the men told me. I was sad to hear of the murder, but I did not worry about it. I had been far away at the time and knew nothing about any murder. It would be easy to explain that. So I went with the men to the large house where Judge Cohen lived. Chapter 12. The judge was an old, kind man, but his face was very serious as he looked at me. He asked a number of men to tell me what they had seen and found the night before. The first man told his story. He and his son were coming home from a long day's fishing. It was a dark night, and on the beach they had fallen over the dead body of a man. They had carried the body to the nearest house, and found that it was a good-looking young man about 25 years old. There were the marks of fingers round his neck. When they spoke of the marks of fingers, I remembered the murder of my brother, and I felt a terrible fear. The son then told his story. He had seen a boat with a man in it not far from the beach. He thought it was my boat. A woman had also seen a man in a boat sailing away from the beach. She thought I was the man. Then I was taken to the room where the dead body lay. How can I tell you what I felt when I saw the body? I put my arms round it and cried, "What have I done? My friend, my dear friend." The body was Henry Clerval's, and so now I had destroyed another person. This third death was too much for me. I fell down in a kind of madness, and they had to carry me from the room. For 2 months I was very ill and wished only to die. But slowly my madness left me, and my health began to return. At last I was able to speak to Judge Cohen, and I asked for news of my family. "There is someone here who can answer your question better than I can," he said. "Your father arrived a few minutes ago and is waiting to see you." For the first time since Henry's death, I felt some happiness. I held out my hands to my father as he came into the room, and he took me in his arms. He gave me the good news that Elizabeth and Ernest were safe and well. I was really too ill to travel, but I asked my father to take me home immediately. The police had found somebody who had seen me on my island at the time of the murder, and so the judge let me go free. My father looked after me on the long journey home and sat with me for every minute. Night after night while I was asleep, I shouted that I was the murderer of William, Justine, and Henry. My father asked me why I said these awful things. I wanted to answer his question, but I could not tell him my terrible secret. He thought that I was still a little mad. We stayed for a few days in Paris on the way home, and Elizabeth wrote to me at our hotel. This is what her letter said. My dearest Victor, I am so happy to know that you will soon be home. But I am afraid that Henry's death is not the only reason for your sadness. Do you still want to marry me, or do you love another woman? You must tell me. I love you, Victor, and I dream of the day when I shall be your wife. But I do not want you to marry me just because your parents wanted it. I can only be happy if you are happy. Do not answer this letter. Wait until you arrive before you give me your answer. But if you are well, and if I can make you smile, I need nothing more to make me happy. With all my love, Elizabeth. I replied immediately. I told her that I loved her very much and wanted to marry her. I remembered the monster's promise to be with me on the night of my wedding. Let him come. We would fight to the death on that night. And after that fight, I would either be dead and at peace, or alive and free. Free to be happy with Elizabeth. We arrived in Geneva soon after my letter had reached Elizabeth. It was wonderful to see her again. She ran into my arms, and I held her close. She cried when she saw how thin and old I looked. She, too, was thinner because she had worried about me so much. But her gentleness and her love made her as beautiful as ever. We agreed that the wedding would be in 10 days' time. As the day came nearer, I became more and more afraid. I tried to hide my fear and laughed and smiled as often as I could. Elizabeth knew that I was unhappy, but she was sure she could give me happiness. She looked forward to our wedding. I began to carry a gun and a knife with me everywhere I went.